Ben Shapiro, editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire, joins me now. Ben, good to see you. Thanks for being here tonight. It almost feels in some of these interviews that are being done with 2020 candidates that this question is kind of a litmus test, and the answer has a lot weighing on it.
I think there's no question that's true. This is why Bernie Sanders is being called to account by a lot of members of the intersectional Democratic Party who are deeply concerned and upset with the idea that he would not endorse slavery reparations. Now, what's hilarious is that what Bernie has said is he said all sorts of bad things have happened to black folks in America, and the best way to get beyond that is with my socialist redistributionist schemes. And Kamala Harris basically agrees with that, but because she calls it slavery reparations and Bernie doesn't, this means that Bernie is insufficiently committed to the idea of race reparations in the country at large. It just goes to show you that race is the central issue for a huge swath of the Democratic Party, and the big dividing line is going to be which is more important, intersectionality or socialist redistributionist policies? Yeah,
I mean, it's clear that these questions are going to be very central to the debate in the 2020 election. But one of the biggest questions, when they're asked this question is how, right? How exactly are you going to repay the debt of slavery, and who is going to repay the debt of slavery exactly?
This is exactly right. And Bernie Sanders said this last night on CNN. I mean, I'm sounding like a Bernie supporter here, but the fact is that Sanders is clearer on this than Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren. And when Kamala Harris is asked how, she immediately begins citing all sorts of kind of normal Democratic government programs that she'd like to see pushed anyway, which is not slavery reparations. That's just what we call the Democratic political agenda. The reality is that slavery reparations per se are completely unworkable. Even big advocates of it, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, have failed to come up with any actual metric for how exactly we'd go about doing that. What do you do with, for example, Barack Obama, whose father was black and not from the United States and therefore not having history with slavery, and a mother who is white? Would his family receive slavery reparations? How about Kamala Harris, whose father is Jamaican and mother is Indian? Does she receive slavery reparations? From whom? Does she receive slavery reparations from me? My great-grandparents got here in 1907, long after slavery was over, and lived their entire lives in the North, where Jim Crow was not in effect. It's almost impossible. I think not almost. It is impossible to come up with a fair metric for recompensing slavery 10 generations after slavery's end. If you want to say that recompense should be had for people who benefited from Jim Crow, again, for people who were harmed by Jim Crow, I think that's an easier case. But again, it's going to be hard to determine who pays, who should get how much, and who receives. Yeah.
And it amounts in the explanation that Kamala Harris gave. She talked about the LIFT Act, which basically would be a tax credit for any families who make under $100,000. And she said that it would, obviously include many families, but that it would include a lot of black families, in her opinion. So it is, as you say, another entitlement, essentially. And when you look at, the amount of money in America that is going to entitlements, you go back to 2008, $430 billion. In 2020, the projected is almost double, $807 billion. So it begs the question, if you continue to throw more money at the problem, what exactly does it solve necessarily?
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, the war on poverty, which was launched in part to rectify a lot of the racial imbalances and evils that had been happening in the country, been manifest in America. We've spent tens of trillions of dollars in the war on poverty, and there's been no actual real receipt from that as far as the number of black people who have been raised from poverty by the war on poverty. Again, if you go back to the war on poverty, at that time, 20% of all black children were born into single mother families. Now it's upward of 70%. The black poverty rate is essentially the same now as it was back in 1970. That does not suggest that throwing money at the problem is a cure for whatever historic ailments have been exhibited on the black community. And not just that. The reality is that we now live in a time where legalized discrimination is not only illegal, but it is, for good reason, looked down upon, sneered at by virtually all Americans. And that means that the vast majority of decisions are in the hands of individuals. If we actually want people to rise in society of any race, what we need to be doing now is focusing on making sure the incentives are aligned so that people make the right decisions to bring themselves up out of poverty. Throwing money at the problem is not slavery reparations. In many cases, it is a way of ensuring that people have an incentive not to make the right decisions.
You mentioned Bernie Sanders and his feelings about the reparations issue, but his way of sort of making up for that is doubling down on how bad the president is. Here he is in the CNN town hall. Watch this.
This president is the first president in the modern history of our country who is trying to divide our people up based on the color of their skin, the country they were born in, their sexual orientation, their gender, their religion. And that is an outrage.
Do you think that's true? Is there evidence to back up those statements?
I mean, it's surely nonsensical on a purely objective level. The fact is that Barack Obama in 2012 had African Americans for Obama and Jews for Obama and gays for Obama. President Obama in 2012 basically decided that he was going to create an agglomeration of various groups associated by race, associated by sexual orientation, women for Obama by sex, and then he was going to stick all those groups together and hope that it was a majority. So the notion that dividing people along racial lines is anything new in American politics is simply not true. The notion that Trump is specifically doing that or openly doing that right now, I'm not seeing the evidence of it.
You know, I guess the big question is what works in the next election, because there's a lot of investment in this identity politics kind of avenue for these 2020 candidates. And where is the United States of America right now, do you think? Will this be something that is appealing to people?
I don't think it's appealing to people. I think that's why Bernie Sanders has outsized popularity inside the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris came out the other day and she said that people should stop ripping on identity politics because it's a way of shutting down the debate. Identity politics itself is the way that people shut down the debate. They say that we can't have a reasoned conversation because I'm not a member of your group and you're not a member of my group. Well, then we can't have any discussion at all. Folks like Kamala Harris are very reliant on identity politics. Bernie actually is not, and it's why he has some advantages inside the Democratic Party primaries.
He lost 3 of his top campaign lieutenants today, so we'll see where the campaign's going. Ben Shapiro, always a pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks a lot.